Okay, welcome everybody to Spiral Dynamics Integral Live. So today we are going to be talking about death, a subject which should be something that we all discuss and ponder at some point in our lives, or maybe frequently, but it's something that, at least in the West, we tend to shy away from. We want sort of the happy ending, the Hollywood happy ending, and we don't want to, we don't want to see those final chapters of life, but it's something that is important to keep in mind. It obviously affects all of us eventually, and before it affects us individually, it affects family members and loved ones. So we were originally going to do this like a group discussion, which it will be eventually, but I decided to prepare a little presentation ahead of time just to frame certain concepts. So I do believe everybody here knows the spiral dynamics framework. Oh, first I have to say this may be our first rated R presentation. There will be violence and grisly images in this presentation. So if there is anybody under 17 that requires parental assistance, please, you can call your parents now. Yeah, I just want to prepare you. I do have some grisly images in this presentation. Again, most of you are very familiar with spiral dynamics, but for the purpose of this recording, just very quickly, spiral dynamics is basically a framework to view the value systems that humans perceive the world through. It started with the research of Claire Graves, and Chris Cohen and Don Beck sort of took it on, and they designated colors to the different steps in, say, evolution of perception, because just the way that biologically all organisms progress on this planet, so too do humans, as we evolve, progress in our capacity to perceive the world. And that's kind of what we're trying to quantify here. Again, as always, the map is not the territory. Every time we try to put something into the box, it's only a perception. So, and it's always, again, skewed by our own perspective, but we make these attempts to help us sort of navigate the world and understand it better. So going to start with beige, which is sort of where the journey starts. And by the way, all of these meme levels exist within us at all times. We all have that beige in us now, but historically speaking, we can think to the early times of humanids and the difficulties that life brought at that time. The life conditions were quite challenging. Death was immediate, ever present, and there was a feeling of constant survival. Today, that translates to, for example, job insecurity. I know many of us, when we lose a job or we don't know where our income is coming from, we sort of go down to that beige survival sense, because it's all about staying alive, and we all need that sort of income to feed ourselves and maintain our family. I wanted to mention Otzi, the Iceman, as a case study for beige survival. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. His mummified corpse was discovered in the Alps between Italy and Austria. He died about 5,000 years ago, and he was probably murdered because they found markings of an arrow in his shoulder. But what's really interesting is in the forensics, all of the information they were able to extract about this man, such as, he was probably in his 40s, but he had many afflictions, cavities, intestinal parasites, Lyme disease, sore knees and hips, shoulders and back, several broken ribs during his lifetime, his nose, and bouts of physical stress, likely stemming from malnutrition, especially leading up to the last months before his death. So he was probably starving to death, and then somebody killed him with an arrow. So I think that kind of summarizes what that beige life existence was probably like. And we have to consider that genetically we carry if we think about epigenetics and this whole idea of trauma that's passed on, it may not, sometimes we think as far back maybe as our grandparents or great grandparents, but really it's just a continuum of passing on genes and some of these emotional things that get passed forward, and how much trauma really there has been for humanity in general. In purple, which is sort of tribal magical, where we're still, a lot of that beige is still there, a lot of the survival instincts obviously are still there, but we are as a group helping to build mythologies, stories to help us make sense of the world. So everything that we see around us starts to have meaning and informs our life and death. And so there are elaborate death rituals and elaborate mourning traditions, and also tapping into the intuitive or the dream state to get information that we need to help heal ourselves or our loved. And today, those purple tribal traditions continue and can really be seen in, well, everywhere, even in modern culture. Obviously, we still have those tribal traditions, but just some particularly interesting ones that you might have heard. In Tibet, when somebody dies, to help them transition into heaven, they basically chop the body into pieces and they throw it for the vultures to eat. And they feel that that helps with the transition. Plus, it's ecological. It helps to get rid of the physical body so the spirit can move on. And the Hindu funeral pyres, well, burning bodies is one way to. It was also quite typical in Nordic countries. Way to say goodbye to the person. And then in an island in Indonesia, there is one island where a people called the Torosians embalm their loved ones after they pass, although they don't believe that they really die as soon as they're what we would consider clinically dead. They just consider them to be sick and not really dead yet until they can have the actual funeral party, which sometimes will take months or even years to actually take place. So during that time that they're sick and that they're embalmed, they get fed, they get brought drinks and food and things like this. And even after they're pronounced officially dead, they're still kept, and most families have at least one of these embalmed bodies in their house. So it's interesting how in some cultures what would be considered horrific or scary, that the stuff of horror films here is just a part of life. So red, egocentric, power gods. I know that red gets a really bad rap, and we oftentimes think, when we think about red, we think about Roman times and how violent Roman society was in certain ways, but and we think about the gladiators killing each other to death, the fight to the death. But in reality, I read that in most gladiator shows, there was not usually a fight to the death. So Hollywood kind of glamorizes this a little bit. This is a snapshot from the film 300, which is very powerful, very violent, sort of encapsulates, I think, what we all think about when we think about the worst case scenario, red, where life really just doesn't matter very much. I think here it's a demonstration of power and fearlessness, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We know that red can also mean standing up for yourself. So there's a positive side to red, being able to defend yourself. So in situations that were precarious and where you could be invaded or something, you needed to fight and to preserve your own life. And then torture sort of being one of the one of the expressions of red, maybe. So it's like not quite death, but it's definitely not life. It's kind of this horrific state between life and death. And today I think we manifest that through video games or violent or scary movies, because I think we all have the need to express that, and to experience death in some way. But since we live in a relatively safe society, we express it through other means. And speaking of torture, I couldn't help but to think about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Even though when we think about Jesus, we think about blue religion, but the way that Christ died, I mean, that was a Roman method of slowly killing people and for everybody to see. So I think that in the past there was, I don't want to say insensitivity, but I think people were just as sensitive in some ways, but death was literally on display for everybody to see. And it occurred to me also that women, they were brave, and they had to face their own battles with death every time they gave birth. So it was kind of like pregnancy and birth was their battle. This is a snapshot from the series House of the Dragon. There was a very dramatic scene there where a woman basically died during childbirth. It was either her or the baby, so they cut her open. And the reality is that countless women have died during birth throughout history. So it's this moment that where life and death meet very closely, because you're bringing a new birth here, but there's the potential for death also. So then we come to the blue authority, absolutistic vMEME, which tries to put red in order a little bit. It's a little bit out of hand, the way that we address death. It's just too violent. Things have to be put in order. And we have the religions that have a book that codifies morality and codifies what we should do before we die, and introduces this important concept of heaven and hell. Not that the concept of the afterlife didn't exist before then, it did. It's just kind of like this black and white view that really comes to the fore. And the idea of judgment day. So if you can get away with doing horrible things now, you won't get away with it eventually, because you will have to pay. On the other hand, you have people who suffer in this life, and they accept it because it's preferable to eternal damnation. So it's kind of this compromise that you make. So if you live as well as you can based on your own moral code, you have that hope that in the afterlife you will get to live the life you didn't get to here. And this idea of atonement before dying, sometimes it's just the question of saying the right words before you go, and that will save you. And I'm sure many of you have seen this meme floating around on the internet, which is quite funny. And then we have the orange strategic achievist. This is sort of the rational value meme, where we start to be able to understand things in a more logical, rational way. And this is good in a lot of ways, because it helps us to dispel certain myths or beliefs that were problematic. But it leads to something that can swing, a philosophy that can swing too far to the other end, which is to become completely atheist or materialist, and you believe that when you die nothing remains, and that's fine. And a lot of people are atheist nowadays. There's also this idea that death is something that should be understood so it can be slowed down, because it's actually a deterrent for progress and achievement. We want to just keep improving things and Illness and death, obviously, that's an issue. Life extension technology is cryogenics. And I'm just mentioning Richard Dawkins because he introduced this idea of the selfish gene. So we're just progressing just to improve biologically and as a species. Okay. And I also wanted to mention that, again, this harkens back to purple in some ways, because in Western society, we have these standardized ways of burying people and these rituals. So the rituals harken back to purple, where somebody is buried in the ground. Usually you go to a church beforehand and a eulogy is given and these sorts of things. And then there's the blue codification of how somebody's allowed to be buried. So you have to be buried in a casket. There's a lot of rules. You can't just throw someone in a river or bury them under the tree like you can with your dog Spot. Like, why can't I be buried under a tree if I want to directly? Why, if I can bury my dog, why can't I bury my grandmother there? But there's these rules in place. And then it also has something to do with orange, because it has to do with this idea of sanitation. And here's a quote from this website that sells caskets saying, "The protection of a casket is often partly to separate the body from the ground. This allows the body to decay naturally without the interference from earth-dwelling insects and bacteria." There's this idea of separating the body from the other elements, which on the one hand is understandable, because throughout history, we've always wanted to honor those who have passed on. We want to honor them. We want to give them a proper burial. We want to be respectful. On the other hand, there are those that would argue that why not let, like in Islamic tradition, it's actually believed that humans have a debt to pay back to the earth elements. And so it is recommended, or it's expected, that you wrap a body in a white linen with direct contact to the ground, so it will decay naturally and the debt is repaid to the earth. Oh, and then I have some casket prices too. You know, it's expensive to die, and a lot of people have insurance to deal with that. So again, blue, orange kind of phenomenon here, having to save money for when you die, so you don't cause financial hardship on the people who survive you. Green. So I actually wasn't too sure what to say about green. I would say that in green, there is an understanding of the natural cycle of life, and also an understanding that other life forms on the planet are important also. So it's not just humans that are important. And also that sort of appreciating and loving Gaia as the planetary body that is helping us to stay alive. And if we don't support it, it won't support us. So understanding life from a more planetary perspective. And from a practical perspective, there are some natural interment alternatives now that people are proposing. Yellow. Okay, so here we have now leaped to second tier. Second tier is supposed to be a leap in consciousness, where we are now able to see a much broader perspective, and we are integrating the perspectives of first tier, which were partial. So we were only seeing kind of a part of the picture, and we thought that people who didn't think like us were wrong, but now we realize that everybody was a little bit right. Everybody had a part of the puzzle. So in yellow, we incorporate views of death from all previous vMEMEs, and we begin to understand the complex interplay of factors that lead to death. And we have more existential questions about life and death in general. We start to view it in broader terms. And a larger web of existence is intuited beyond the mind. Also, I think we start to see it from an evolutionary perspective. And then we go to turquoise. Again, in turquoise, everyone's going to have a different interpretation. This is my interpretation. I'll love to hear what you all have to say about it. I think in turquoise, we really come to the full understanding that we are all fractals of consciousness. We begin to see ourselves as fractals of consciousness, not just the body with the spirit that came here and then the spirit leaves. Yeah, maybe that's a part of it. That's one way to understand it. But we are literally a fractal of consciousness, and we come here to have an experience. And it's all quantum information that gets reabsorbed into the field. Some people like to refer to this as the Akashic libraries, where all the information is stored. People might tap into past lives, find ways to tap into the past lives to inform current problems so that they can continue on this evolution. And this idea of living life with that intention. So you're living life consciously and not unconsciously, so that you do accomplish some of those goals that you had before you transition and before you came here. Again, I'm presuming here, which not everyone may believe this, but I'm presuming that that there is a conscious decision to come here, and not everybody believes this. I'm partly basing this on many near-death experience people that I've heard talk about what they experienced on the other side before coming back here. Many of them talk about soul contracts and things like that. Again, for many people, this may be very woo, maybe, so we may agree or disagree with this. And then this idea also that this material reality is only one expression and there are other dimensions. So this physical reality is one dimension, there are other dimensions and many more things to experience, not only in this life on this planet, but elsewhere, possibly in this universe. And then there's coral, which I know absolutely nothing about. So here's a picture of some pretty coral. And so the questions that I think we could discuss now are, what vMEME related to death do you think you most resonate with? And if there's something you would add to what I presented that you thought I was missing, or maybe that I didn't get quite right. And also, if you care to share any experiences related to death, again, if there's anything that anybody wants to share that is sensitive, you can just say it before you speak and it will be edited out. Okay. Okay, we have Zafir, who's jumped in the queue first.
Yes, I just want to add something to the red behavior with death, which I think was very important in our development, that you might not mention, is that they were looking for eternity, for living forever, like the Egyptian. They had a very big tombs with gift and food, and even in the Romic culture that you mentioned, they want to achieve immortality in order to live forever by winning death. And this gave for all other vMEMEs these ideas of living forever, which we are still finding in other vMEMEs, which of course in purple we didn't have it, because in purple they were looking about the cycles of life, and it was very natural to die.
Good point. That's a good point. Thank you for that, Zafir.
I was going to say something similar, and that is about the Norse sagas and how heroes lived forever in song and in legend, right? Very Norse tradition, but other European traditions as well. So that's the red idea, that your deeds and tales of your life outlive you.
Okay. Bill.
Veronica, that was excellent. I really enjoyed that. I feel like I may be, I wonder if other people feel the way I do, that up to orange, it's fairly obvious, but I'm still a little bit confused with green and yellow. I have no idea about coral and turquoise, but would you mind just restating what green and yellow is about? Because I think that's more edgy, and it was more new to me. I don't know whether everybody else feels that way or not, but
I can try, but again, it's my own interpretation, and I'm not sure that I have full clarity either. Okay, so for me, green is recognizing that our own life depends on the life of this planet, thinking more planetarily, and also being concerned about other life forms on the planet. Before, I don't think we kept track of the whale population, but now we can see a direct correlation with the growth of human population and the decline of wild animals, and we're concerned about that. And I think that's an expression of green, also an expression of orange, because we have the scientific methods to keep track of these numbers. But sort of that sensitivity, which one could argue also existed, in purple, or so it's not like we didn't care about nature before, we did, but we can see things on a more global scale, and therefore we have concerns about how that will impact us. So we might have in the past been concerned about our own life and our family, but now we're worried about what if in a couple decades the whole planet collapses because the planet can't sustain itself with our resource use and extraction. So, and yellow is tricky. Yellow is tricky. I mean, yellow and turquoise kind of blend together for me, but it's about reality starts to bend at this point. And so everything that we see is no longer quite what we realized it was before. And the stories that we tell ourselves no longer are so solid anymore. That's all I can say, but yeah, watching a near-death experience, a lot of people talk about what their experiences were like, has partially informed what
Sorry for jumping in, Veronica. Can I give another answer?
Sure. And then Mary can have
Yeah,
her.
just do it fast. I think the main value systems that green added is that dying is a worst thing that can happen. This is a human rights, which was in orange and blue. You don't mind killing people like we see Putin doing today in red and blue. And orange, there is less sensitivity for other people of dying. In green, we are really trying to preserve life, keep life quality, and everything that people dying is tragic. When we jump to yellow, we can see that this is just another way of thinking, and we can accept that sometimes people die in the process. That's it.
Yeah, sort of like we can see that as horrific as war is, as part of the evolutionary journey that is unfortunate, but may have positive.
Yeah, jumping, there is something brutal of accepting yellow in a way.
Last week we were talking about the atomic bomb, and as horrific as it was, it did seem to the war. That, like, kind of the irony that the most destructive weapon actually helped to end the war. So,
Exactly.
yeah, just being able to step back in second tier and saying maybe there's more to this that I cannot pass judgment on right now, because there's a bigger picture here that I don't fully understand. Mary, go ahead.
Thank you. I think my comments will link what you've said and the recent comment. My friends are all in their 80s because I've retired 5 years ago and moved from one area of the country to another. And my husband and I owned a cemetery, and that was part of our work before. And we also lost 7 family members, youngest being 22, oldest being 96 over the last couple of years, several years. And so I just decided I would study death pretty intently. And I'm also pretty deep into spiral dynamics. One of the things you mentioned early with with beige, was that job represented security, that was the survival. And I found that as people age, and it could be an orange thing, but it's not quite, that health becomes the security. And so where a younger person might put all their energies into securing that job that's going to keep them alive and pay their bills, the folks I'm around, what they talk about when they gather is the newest illness or what might be impacting there. And so that seemed to switch a little bit. Interesting to me. But I decided, because I'm very deeply spiritual person, I decided as part of my study of death, I would do various practices from different spiral dynamic levels. And so have done some pretty deep things by through meditation or active imagination, and some guided things into the briar burning of fires, and just to try to embrace this death. And I thought what I found when you get to the green level is it's so much about unity and service that it's almost more about the community than your own security. And so that's where that natural instinct to care for the earth, etc., and where that moves to yellow is through, in my opinion, for the human, for me, the way I explored it was through mind-body medicine. And so then you start tracking your dreams, and then pretty soon some of the mystical experiences that are invisible to others, or perhaps unearthly, tie then with the cycle and the unity of it all and the cohesiveness of the entire spiral. So we move all the way, as you can see, from trying to stay alive at red just by eating, to clear up here where it's life, though it's valued as a spiral, that it continues on, and that I am a contributor, and that's the green, the service of green, to basically the web of life of yellow. And really been playing a lot with various things, and found that different symbols would then enter my dreams. And then curiosities, once you start toying with yellow, and I'll show you what happened. Like just yesterday, synchronicities start showing up pretty deeply. And this was something, and you recognize this? These are two vultures, and they began following me last week on my daily walks, which was curious because after we had a family suicide, and after that for a year, a pair of doves followed me for a year. So there's all kinds of mystical, weird stuff, and I am really not particularly weird myself. But because I decided I am going to dig into this and try to experience it from a spiral dynamic perspective. And some of that is because my husband and I worked in the cemetery business, and we were deep, deep orange. It's not just the casket. You also have to place those caskets in a vault. And the vaults then are made of fiberglass, and all depends on your cemetery's rules. Ours was private, but we had to honor the state's rules and our county's rules. So that we were pretty deeply steeped in, well, when you work as an undertaker, you have a lot of different experiences. So all of this is just really, that's part of why I signed up today. I thought, oh, this will intrigue me to hear from other folks. So thank you for giving me the floor. I appreciate it.
Wow, Mary, that's amazing. I think you should have been giving this presentation.
Oh, I'm as confused as anyone. And especially, I approach things intellectually in order to deal with them emotionally, because like I mentioned, and I'm going to say it again, we've lost 7 family members in a short period of time. And so this is one of the ways I've been grieving. And it's been very helpful to me as an intellectual. So,
yeah, I think I would say a lot of us in this group are very sensitive, and we rely on our intellect to try to make sense of the world because we perceive a lot, and I think it helps us. Spiral dynamics and other frameworks, Enneagram, help us to navigate a little bit better because we sense things. I think we're all very intuitive, but then the intellect kicks in. Sometimes it's helpful. Most of the time it's helpful. Sometimes it can get in the way, but yeah, we do have that tendency here. Nish, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. Thank you for a great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Really resonated with your descriptions of pretty much every stage there. I wanted to make just a couple of suggestions and questions, and please, these are just suggestions, so anybody please feel free to disagree. The first one about some of the really early stages, beige, purple, red. I'm wondering, when we talk about death as a concept, or even as a intuition, if we first need to have developed some kind of sense of somebody who's dying. In other words, some kind of sense of self that's actually then going to conceive of itself as dying before death even becomes a problem or a concept or a thought. And if we look at the very first 2 stages, at beige, I don't think conceptual thinking or even symbolic thinking has probably not arisen yet. We're just surviving instinctively, and that instinctive behavior enables us to survive. But I'm wondering if somebody at beige thinks that way, or if they're just doing what they need to do instinctively. So if death would even exist as a concept for somebody who's beige at that point. And even at purple, we're starting to distinguish ourselves from reality, but we're not fully distinguished yet as a full-blown ego, a full-blown separate self. We're still embedded in our environment and in our tribe to some degree, which is where magical thinking, for example, stems from. So even there, when we think about death, I'm wondering if the experience or concept would really be death as an ending in the way that we would think of it today, or it's just like a seamless transition into another dimension that also exists seamlessly with this one. So my sense is that it's at red, early red, where we develop a sense of separate self or separate ego for the first time, where death really becomes a problem, and where death even arises as a concept for the first time, and fear of death then arises for the first time. And then maybe blue, once we've done our red and our power and our hero journey, blue becomes a way of dealing with that incredible fear of death that must be there at red, because we are now identifying ourselves as a separate self who's going to die for the first time. So that's just one possible way of thinking about how death and our awareness of death might evolve through those first 3 stages. And the second thing, when you talked about green, brilliant the points you made. One other possible thing that I think maybe happens at green to many people is that the spirituality that we largely rejected at orange because of our rational scientific thinking starts to re-emerge in some form, because we start to look at existential issues again. But it re-emerges in a way that's very different from blue. We don't tend to go back to blue traditional religion. But I think there is a green spirituality. I think a lot of the New Age movement is at its best a green spirituality. And I think here we can start to look at things again like reincarnation, past life memories, near-death experiences, these kind of things start to interest us again at green, but often without the dogma that we attach to them at blue. So it's a much more universal, progressive kind of spirituality that emerges again at green, I think. So yeah, just two possible points to make, but yeah, please feel free to disagree.
No, that's great. I love all these layers that we're adding to sort of refine this view. Thank you so much, Nish. Appreciate that. Eric.
Hi, Veronica. Thank you for your amazing presentation. If I may share an observation and a question. So it's amazing how abundant and brilliant spiral dynamics is about life, and how little it actually says or tells about death, which is so omnipresent. And one of the two things is paying taxes and that you will eventually probably die, right? And you kind of summarized and distilled a lot out of what's out there. So it's very, it was an observation that it's so little said about death. Another observation that I had is where we said in the beige and lower stages, there's more ego in things, and the further you go up, there's more about holistic things. And might it be that the lower we are, the value of death and how you die for the group is more valuable, whereas when you go up, the value of life and how you live is actually considered to be more valuable. And from orange on, you don't want to die, where in blue it might still be good to sacrifice yourself for the group, so to say. So maybe there is some skill there. And the last question that I have is, based on what you put in your presentation, is it possible to kind of talk to people in a certain stage who are primarily in a certain stage about death? So even in terms of therapy or helping to cope with things, might there be some sort of a system or some sort of a skill to talk to ourselves and each other with this thing? So if you're talking to a purple somebody, how should you approach the subject? And might there be something for us to find out and distill in there? Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Oof, that's a big question. How do you talk to somebody? I mean, first you would have to discern where their center of gravity is memetically, and that's sometimes it's more obvious and sometimes it's not so much so. But I think the best that we can do is just to speak the language of the other person, because we really can't change their perspective. And even this whole idea, which is an important idea, of whether life continues and how does life continue, but it's one stop, heaven and hell, and that's where you're going to be, or this idea that we come back, which is in the Hindu tradition, but also is very pervasive in the New Age and sort of the more universal spirituality movements now, that this idea that there's continuum afterwards. But again, like Nish said, without the dogma. So if you feel like this is just a chapter in a longer story, whether you are consciously aware of it beyond this life or not, and whether you can make somebody feel more at peace about it. Because actually my daughter, who just turned 12 this past year, she's been asking me a lot of questions about death and how do I talk to her about it? And because I happen to have been listening to a lot of stories about near death, and I mean, from the monotheistic tradition, it's very clear cut, heaven and hell. And even though I come from the monotheistic tradition, I'm very informed by it, and I see a lot of beauty and truth in it. I've never really believed in a sharp heaven and hell reality afterwards. And I do believe that we continue somehow, maybe not, but so how do I convey that to my daughter? So I don't know, I tell her stories. I basically tell her that that we will meet again. And that could be me choosing to inhabit my purple, because it maybe is a myth. I don't know if I'm going to be with her again, but in that moment, it feels comforting, and it's comforting to her. So I choose purple in that moment. As far as your other question, I'm trying to remember what your other question was, had to do with how we value life and death as we progress through the spiral. Like, I think you were saying that earlier.
I mentioned there might be some sort of a scale where the lower, when you're purple, it's all about the tribe and you might sacrifice, and there is something like a good death, right? Whereas the higher you go, you might actually talk about the absence of death or a good life, something to that effect.
Yeah, it's funny. I was going to put this thing, I didn't have time, but I was going to make a remark about granny. I was going to mention theoretical granny that appears in this timeline, like from beige. And in beige, granny is just sacrificed when she gets to be too much trouble. And in purple, granny is the medicine woman. So they keep her around as long as possible. But, maybe at some point also, I don't know. Or she sacrifices herself because she realizes that she's, weighing down the tribe. And in red, I don't know. I haven't thought about granny in red yet. I have to think about that one a little bit more. In blue, I'm not sure either. But then I was thinking about granny in today's times, where granny has Alzheimer's, and what do you do with granny? Do you put her in a nursing home, or do you keep her at home? And I'm not really answering your question, am I? I'm just going on.
I think it can't be answered, but it might be an interesting observation, and especially when you hear, for instance, especially in Japan, where they have a very, very aging population, where elderly people are actually kind of offering to say goodbye, so to say. Where does this sit in the spiral, so to say?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that this is a clear-cut answer for that. And it also depends on individual decisions, family decisions, all through the spiral, so I'm not sure that that's very clear-cut. Hey, Josh.
I have a coffee cup on that very last statement. Sorry. Yeah, so I wonder if it's green. It's a green mindset of, all right, you're 88, just be good to everyone else and say goodbye. I'm wondering if that's like a green kind of idea of like, everyone gets their chance. You had your chance. It's over now.
Seem green.
Anyways, I'm just throwing
green. I think green wants to respect the life of I don't know. I don't see green doing that, but I'm not sure.
But I know there euthanasia is now in Canada.
Oh,
anyways.
okay, I can see kind of it's instead of a pro-choice thing as far as babies, it's a pro-choice thing in terms of death. Like I can choose to die. Okay, I can see that. Yeah. Okay. Paul, you have another coffee cup, and then Josh.
I was struck by when the conversation started to somewhat equate death with change. I don't know if anybody of you read the poem that Marjorie posted by Langston Hughes. I'll read it. Dear lovely death that taketh all things under wing, never to kill, only to change into something, some other thing, this suffering flesh. To make it either more or less, but not again the same. Dear lovely death, change is thy other name. I think it's interesting that the graphic that you used when you posted the announcement of this.
Yes.
You put the death card. In tarot terms, death isn't really about that card isn't really about death.
Right.
It's about change.
Right, because you have the rose coming out of the side, so it's a symbology. So it looks like a scary card at first, but then you have the beautiful white rose coming out of the side. So death represents a change. Exactly. That was a beautiful poem too. Okay. Josh, horror writer Josh Schlossberg.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a working theory I'm trying to still piece out, but I believe that humanity, I think it's across the vMEMEs. I haven't parsed it out too much, so I'd be curious to hear any feedback, but is both obsessed with the fear of death and wants to be immortal, and at the same time is in denial of basically walking headlong into premature death. So it's both like so afraid of the thing, like arguably irrationally afraid of a thing which has to happen, is clearly natural, whatever. And then at the same time, will be doing all sorts of reckless behaviors or unhealthy behaviors that we know is hastening our death. And I think where those two meet is it's denial, right? So like something scares you so much you pretend it's not happening. And I trace the destruction of the environmental world. Like people are always talking about it, and people are like, oh, it's greedy corporations. It's like, yeah, but like go on, right? It's like, okay, well, it's capitalism. It's like, yes, but keep going, and keep trying to peel away the layers. And it's our desire. What's the consumption? What's the overconsumption? The need to like accumulate, which is to take from nature. I think it's partially a distraction from our impending death and death that we're hastening. But I also think it's, why do people and often men accumulate resources? It's a status thing, right? Well, because, traditionally speaking, and still in many cases, you get to the higher echelons of status, you have more opportunity for mating, right? Okay, well, what's the deal with why do some women are drawn to that? Well, it's better resources for children. Okay, what's the obsession with children? That's kind of like your attempt to prolong your immortality through your DNA or whatever, even though, in like 3 generations, your DNA becomes like a drop in that and it's meaningless. But so I think so, like, oh, we got to live forever. We got to live forever. And it's like, and now we are arguably pushing ourselves off of a cliff in terms of, overpopulation, overconsumption, ecosystem collapse. In a more modern thing is, we've created we're allowing a new number 3 or 4 cause of death, COVID. And it's just like, that's not happening. It's a mild cold. Don't even talk about it. So it's like, I think, can spiral dynamics help us both come to terms with the death thing, not be in denial of it? I don't know. That's where my thinking is.
Okay. Thanks, Josh. Khalid?
Wow, such an amazing topic, Veronica. It's like it's something that really touches it all, and at the same time, it's a mystery. I mean, let's put spiral dynamics aside now. Let's just talk even just from the human perspective. Death is a huge mystery. If you're really present at the moment of the death of someone, regardless of how prepared you are, a relative is about to die, or someone is sick and you're preparing for it and that something is going to happen. But at that moment of death, it's as if the whole universe ends. Something happens, something that is indescribable. And the more present you are at the presence of death, the more you feel the shift. You can even feel it with the death of a kitten. You can feel it with the death of a flower. It's a huge mystery. And I know this sometimes offends people, but with all the theories that we have about death, no one has any idea what happens after death. We can say there's heaven and hell. We can say there's reincarnation. We can say there's atoms that go to the ground. No one has any idea. So all that has happened, in my opinion, along the history of humanity is that according to our stage of mind, according to our spiral level, according to our meme, we try to give the ego or to give the sense of self a solution and the meaning so that we can go on with life. Something's going to happen. We have no idea what it is, but we need to live. So we have to give an answer to this. And the answer will only come from the level of cognitive complexity that we hold, spiral level, consciousness level, whatever we call it. But then when we look on the other dimension, I like to talk about stages of mind, spiral, and stages of heart. And on this psycho-spiritual ego development process, one of the identifiers I like to give for it is capacity for uncertainty. So at the lower stages of heart, in what I call the striving heart and the unavailable heart and the heart that is just wanting to live, there's almost no capacity for uncertainty. That's why we live in a sense of trying to control. We want to control everything. We even want to control death because there's no capacity for uncertainty whatsoever. So our sages, regardless, are they purple sages, red sages, blue sages, orange sages, green sages, our sages try to give us answers so that we can go on. But as this level of stage of heart evolves and we hold this capacity for uncertainty, we start having a harmony between the subjective and the objective. And our view of the objective is no longer extremely tainted by the fears and the anxieties of the subjective. And then we become calmer with death. Then we can accept death for the mystery that it is. And then only can we live a virtuous life. Because it's not a life guided by the fear of death. It is a life guided by living and dying and the cycle and the structure and the circle as it flows. Again, all of this will be described in every stage depending on the mentality or the complexity of the stage or the values, the vMEME that holds the stage. And it's from this that we can start to look at what beige sees and purple. I agree with Nish. I call beige and purple pre-egoistic stages. They don't really have an ego yet. So they will just be part of the flow. There's no subjective that can affect the objective and vice versa. But it's from the red that, again, we need to satisfy this mystery of death and this fear of shame of the vMEME of the red. The blue and this starting to understand that there is another dimension to time called the future. And now I want to live for the future. And the orange, which is now purely objective or trying to be, of course, totally subjective, but thinking they're objective. And then the green, which now realizes again the subjective. And the description of death and the rituals of death will always satisfy these as we go on. So just my little 2 cents there.
Bravo, Khaled. That was beautiful. It all comes down to being able to embrace uncertainty. And I think that most humans are fear-driven. A lot of us are fear. I mean, one of the qualities of second tier is supposed to be that we lose that fear. Do we really know what that means? Are we really beyond fear? I think a lot of us still have a hard time embracing that uncertainty. So that was really nice. So I know Alex is next, but Nish has his little coffee cup up, which means he has a quick comment. So first Nish and then Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Khaled. I just had a quick question for Khaled. I completely agree with everything you've said, which is that, if I've understood you correctly, that many of the teachings that we've been given about death largely serve the function of helping us to cope with the uncertainty of death so that we can carry on with life. Do you think there's also another aspect to these teachings, which is that they are ways in which saints and sages have tried to interpret their own states of consciousness, which have given them genuine insights into something that is beyond life and death? In other words, is there more than just uncertainty coping, but genuine insights that come from higher states?
I like to say, if we look a little bit deeper, except for the materialistic view of orange, which is atoms that disappear, except for that one, all other interpretations of death actually point to one unified thing, that in some way or another, consciousness continues. And these state experiences or awakening experiences of all the sages and saints and prophets and point to this, that they're trying to tell us. Even near-death experiences are almost pointing to this. But again, we can't really have a proof of it, but it seems that everything is pointing towards this. If I am confident in one thing, is that consciousness continues after that. But in what shape? Is it an individualistic consciousness? Is it a consciousness that melts back into the ocean and becomes part of the collective consciousness? Who knows? We don't know. But we can almost be certain that consciousness continues in a way that we cannot comprehend. And even the sages themselves are just trying to comprehend it for themselves and trying to give us a meaning. So that would be my belief about it. Again, it's just a belief that we cannot describe something that most probably is undescribable and incomprehensible in our domain of consciousness.
Okay, thanks to both of you. Alex.
I raised my hand before Josh and Khaled spoke, and I think you both addressed exactly what was emerging for me. So I'll say that I've been seeing a lot of bees on my walks, bees walking on the sidewalks, dead or dying. And when I do, I feel, I tend to feel like just a lot of grief, like here's this bee dying away from its hive. And yesterday, just after walking by one, I said to my wife, it's like, imagine if you had two fundamental worldviews. One is, this is it, absolutely it. And another is that some form of reincarnation happens. And it just struck me like the experience of solving for that anxiety. So reincarnation, true or not, and all the other resolutions, Kala, that you mentioned from every other vMEME, like if you imagine them as, dying is a life condition, being solved for at a level of value and worldview, then you've got all these ways to solve for the anxiety, the dread, the mystery, the uncertainty of death. And it's like, thank God, because like imagining living with a deep certainty that this is it. I experience that as like, that would be paralyzing, most likely for me. And I imagine for a lot of people, so like to really confront that, and the only option is this is it. Like, oh my God, risk goes down, adventure goes down, vitality goes down. So I was just thinking about each vMEME solving for the life condition of death from its unique perspective, and almost perhaps a great driver of the evolution of each of the values, confronting death as one of the most important life conditions that we have to face with and solve for. And I'm done with that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex.
I have a coffee cup on that one.
Okay.
I was counting how many times you said God, Alex. Just found that ironic. It was like, well, I think it was 3 times.
Okay.
I'm curious what that means to you.
I'm just making it. I'm just letting you know. You're thanking God that there might be reincarnation, which is ironic. Anyways.
Okay. Christian?
Hey, so yeah, I guess some thoughts around death kind of came up for me because again, like my context, growing up kind of in the LDS Mormon space, again, they have like pretty much like, yeah, like a pretty strong worldview of like cosmology of like what happens after death. And they have like these, 3 different planets, and then depending on how righteous and worthy you are in this life, you get to go into one of those planets or whatever. And again, that's what I grew up as a kid up until I was like in my early 20s. And but then leaving that worldview, that kind of world for black and white thinking, yeah, I think I started deconstructing that narrative and deconstructing kind of like from a stage 5 and kind of more looking at Mormonism as like how because again, like when they use missionaries to go recruiting, getting people to convert, they really do use that kind of narrative of the afterlife. And so I think there's a few things that makes, like, from a marketing term, there's this term called concept called USP, unique selling proposition. And a lot of religions, preach all day, every day, life after death, heaven or hell after death. But I think what makes the Mormon church a little unique is that they preach that, and really heavily, but more specifically that if you do all the right things and you follow our path and you go to the temple and you do some rituals, that you can be sealed with your family for eternity. So like eternal family connection, they like really sell that point and emphasize that pretty heavily. And again, it's like, from my perspective as kind of like, in the sales and marketing space, it's a very kind of emotionally manipulative, persuasive sales hook that keeps people, again, wanting to be with their family in the afterlife, gives them a certain a certain level of certainty after death. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of like, like me growing up in that space, leaving that space, and like reflecting on that kind of cosmology, and just seeing how they just use the like other fives in that group that were kind of controlling the fours, again, just trying to use a spiral persuasion manipulation perspective on it. Again, they leverage death as a motivator, as a way to convert, and a way to kind of, again, shift, whatever worldview they had in the past over to their worldview, and kind of creating that certainty and emotional kind of triggers from there. So again, but yeah, so I guess for me, again, leaving that and also like deconstructing death, I did start exploring different cultures and different worldviews directly. And anything from like the bardos, the bardos from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, to even like more indigenous cosmologies of death, whether it's Mexica from Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, their cosmology, to Purépecha from Michoacan, the indigenous people there, and again, like other groups kind of all over. But again, like, it's just interesting seeing these kind of shared narratives of what they perceive, and kind of creating that group cohesion through these narratives. So but yeah, I mean, those are just some thoughts that came up for me when I think about death, and I think I can just go more into different threads, aspects of it. But yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Christian. Appreciate it.
Following up on that, the blue need for certainty, right? For truth. And of all the stages, blue treats death with a certainty of what will happen, right? The way you were describing it, Christian, I think was just an excellent description. And whatever blue truth people buy into, particularly the more fanatical religions, the less uncertainty there is about death, because you know what will happen. And if you think about how uncomfortable people's life's conditions were for a lot of history, being certain that they could be better in death is sort of a sad but true option.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Nicholas.
Hi, first off, glad to be here. I guess there's a lot of different things I could say, but I guess I'll start out with I had like a near-death experience in the mountains where, to me, that experience with like 5 feet of snow and not being able to move, once I accepted that death would be okay to happen at that time, it was one of the best feelings I've ever had, because I knew it was like you know it's a mystery, but you know it's okay at the same time. And to have that is kind of like a key to like unlocking different ideas, especially along the stage, to know that about death. So so like I also worked in mental health, so seeing people at the very low levels of functionings who are nonverbal, when you told them like, hey, your mom died, their only reaction was me, and they just kept on going. They ate breakfast, versus higher up, you told them that someone died, they're like, good riddance, that was it. Oh, sorry, I think that's my first story. I got a little bit emotional because the memories of it, because death is something that's very transforming. In tarot card, some don't have it as death, but they have it as transformation. It's transforming from one thing to another thing. In tribal groups, if you ask how was it like that your ancestors died, they're like, they're not dead. I talked to them yesterday, because it isn't that abstract as what Orange makes it out to be. Orange, I mean, is probably where it becomes the most death is something else besides life. So one thing I do kind of want to pose as a question is looking at it from blue to green, how blue would say that like contraceptives and even to like abortion is green being okay with a different sort of death, where they choose where green chooses who's able to become alive, whereas instead of being okay with killing people in blue and lower memes, green and above is okay with not letting life in. And that's one thing I'm kind of wondering about with this topic of the meme levels at this point. Thanks for letting me share.
I have a quick coffee cup. Nicholas, I wanted to ask you if your near-death experience was near-death in the sense that you almost died and you accepted it, so it was transformative in that sense, but you were still in your body, or did you actually go somewhere and come back?
That time I didn't quite leave my body. I mean, there's been a couple of other different times where it's like going into like a white voidish light that's indescribable. There it was more like it was going somewhere where it was like going in a state that was completely the opposite of the state I was in to a degree. So it's like when you're in the middle of a blizzard and it's like sub-zero temperatures and you didn't pack enough winter gear, and you go from that feeling of freezing to feeling overwhelmingly warm. It's like such a shift that something else is going on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, understood. All right, thank you so much for that, Nicholas.
Hey, you're welcome.
Hey, Marjorie, you're on.
Hey, yeah, I put several things in the chat. Yeah, when we talked, I heard some people talking about uncertainty. And from my perspective, death is about the most certain thing there is in life. It's pretty much guaranteed. It's on the calendar, and it's kind of like an agreement. I think you mentioned it, Veronica, for part of your belief system is that you believe that we chose to come here. And I think part of that choice is to agree that we will die. There is no choice about it. And I like what someone else said about the transformation part, that it is a changing, it's transforming from one thing to another. And I believe that, I think it's quoted in A Course in Miracles, that death is like just changing, like our body is just like a suit of clothes, and we just take off that suit of clothes and we go on to the next, that birth is a continuation of the life that we knew before we came here, and death is a continuation of that life after we leave here. That's just a belief system. I have no way of proving that, but I feel it. It's kind of a knowing, kind of a gnosis for myself, at least. And I think that there's just a distinction between death itself and the dying process, or just dying.
Yeah.
Because from a certain perspective, we are dying even as a biological process. Our body is dying from the moment of birth, and our cells within our body die, and new cells born all the time. And someone had said, I don't know if it was true or not, I believe it's probably true, that the major organs in the body reproduce themselves and change within like 7 years. You have a new liver or something like that. So the body is continually dying and being reborn. So I just think it's part of the natural process of life. It's guaranteed. It's an agreement. And as far as the evolutionary process, even going on the spiral from one stage or developmental level to the next, something must die in order for that new level to be attained. And for me, I kind of think there's a beauty. I see the beauty in it. It's life. To me, life and death are the same. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. I always love your philosophical musings, Marjorie.
Thank you. I put in the chat a song that's meaningful to me. It's called Into Dust by Mazzy Star. I put the lyrics there, and there's a link. It's a very melancholy melody, but a very beautiful melody. And I tend to resonate in the melancholy world a lot. That's just who I am.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bet.
So something I don't feel like we spent that much time. I'm going to try to show my shirt. I don't know if you can read it. Can you guys read it? It might be backwards.
Spiritualist.
Yeah. This is an ironic spiritual shirt. So I want to talk about what's worse than death, because we're talking about death, but there's a lot of, I think from different worldviews, there's a lot of things that are worse than death. And I'm just guessing from my own perspective, and everyone can disagree with me, but I think of the Klingons, like it's a good day to die, right? To die with honor is so good and so wonderful. And so the red wants to die with honor. That's the whole thing, is like, how can I find the most honorable way to die? And dying without honor is so terrible. It's like worse than death. Like having a meaningless death is, I think, a red concept. And then Christianity, I mean, being in hell, Christians, I was raised Christian, as most of you know. My father is or was a pastor. He just retired. And like we were taught about, everyone's got eternal life. Every soul is eternal life. Like that is happening. It's not a question. Like death is just you going to the next stage. And being in hell, being tortured in hell was something that was taught every week in church. So that's way worse than death. The fiery lake of fire was talked about a great deal. So eternal life is the thing that my dad would talk to us about, and that's what you want to have. All right. So then orange, I feel like I probably still have a very orange view of death. I'm going to talk about the biohacking community. So biohacking is all about life extension and like doing all kinds of things like cold exposure and Wim Hof method and all these different mechanisms that I read tons of books on, regulating blood sugar and exercising and doing just so much, like honing your daily routine to make sure that your life lives. And I think the thing that's worse than death for the biohacking orange community is having, just being in a hospital bed for 10 years on a life support system. Like, that's worse than death at orange. You want to just be unconscious and believe that your consciousness is ended, because that idea of just being a vegetable or just barely conscious and just having people wipe your butt and feed food through the tube or something, that's worse than death at orange. And then I think at green, worse than death is just being an oppressive person, like going through and maybe like cutting down trees or being racist or whatever those things are. Those people are worse. They should just be dead, because it's worse than death to be alive and being oppressing others. So I think that's just a few of the levels that I thought of. But death is not the worst thing at a lot of levels. Like, it really is. There's way worse than death at some of these levels. So that's my 2 cents. And of course, everyone can disagree. I'm happy with that.
Yeah, I really like that thought. And what's worse than death at each level, right? The vegetative state, right? I mean, my family has gone to, there will be hospice, there will not be tubes and life extensions. My mom and dad actually called the local paramedics and talked to them about it and let them know that, these are people that they know, they're friends, right? And to say, I'm having a heart attack and you get, 3 pumps, and if you can't immediately revive me, I'm gone, right? You're not allowed to do more measures. That's a hard thing to say to a friend. You're not allowed to save me, right? And yet I think it's really important. And maybe that's, somebody mentioned the assisted suicide and, the right to stop living when you wanted to. Mm-hmm. There's, I suspect that's partly an orange thought, but then it's also, a very childish, immature thought. I'm having a temper tantrum today, so I'm going to kill myself, right? Depending on what level it comes at. But the idea that there are things so much worse than death, it is really important in most philosophies and at most stages. And then the question becomes, which things are worse than death, and how and why?
Yeah, those are really good points. But I think the whole biohacking thing is an important point. And I meant to include something in my presentation that I heard this guy talk recently. You probably know who he is, but I'm forgetting his name. I need to look him up. Who is trying to hack death. Basically, he feels that he gets blood transfusions from his son, and he feels that his life mission is to hack death so that we won't die.
I hate that guy. I think he's such a creeper. I know who you're talking about.
Okay. All right.
It is very creepy to go to all sorts of means. The moonshot folks have a big project of hacking death, right? They're charging like, $100,000 a year to rich people to go through these medical programs that'll keep them alive longer. I mean, maybe it's good in terms of a research program, right? They're finding things that normal doctors can't do research on and all of that. But, then you begin to wonder, are we headed to a world where rich people, can live healthy, not as vegetables or semi-vegetables to 120, 130, and poor people die earlier and earlier because our, you talk about biohacking, but even just our poor food system, our lack of exercise, right? The average couch potato is decreasing their lifespan enormously. and doctors don't seem to be doing much about it, because guess what? Telling you to go walk 5 miles a day doesn't make a penny for anybody in the system.
Plus, you can't really change people's behavior, but yeah, that's a big problem.
Well, no, you can. You know, some of the local, a couple of the local medical HMOs are actually bribing the elderly to do exercise. So if you can get into an exercise program, prove you're doing it, they're giving you some sort of advantages on your insurance, right? So you can. I mean, and maybe just saying that I will pay you to get off your couch and go do something useful gives, in an orange society, in a capitalist society, gives people the signal that there's something there, right? That this is not just some doctor ranting and raving about your lifestyle being unacceptable, that there's actually something there about staying healthier.
Well, again, in orange terms, cost benefit analysis, if that's going to save the health system money down the road, it might be
precisely
a modest investment that's worth doing. So that's an interesting idea.
Precisely. And then there's other systems where they're not doing anything preventative, as near as I can tell, because the back of the envelope bean counter calculation says that if I don't do anything, people will die more quickly and I won't have to pay so much in long-term healthcare costs.
I was kind of reflecting on this train of thought about eternal life and kind of the relationship between the Christian version of it, concept of eternal life and reincarnation. And it brought to my mind, I remember watching a movie a number of years ago. And the premise of the movie was something happened that in the humanity that people could start remembering. It was based on the concept that yes, reincarnation really does happen. And what was going on is that everybody in the world could remember all their past lives. And kind of the net result of that is everybody was depressed and everybody was guilty, and it was just it was a horrible thing. And there was one person in the world who was able to forget their past lives. And the point of the thing was that, you know, it's a good thing that we die, and it's a good thing that that dying transforms us and makes us forget. We're not allowed to easily remember our past lives. And that death, just like life, is a transformation, you know. And it's just, I don't know, I'm always struck with how the idea that something goes on forever only doesn't change is why that's such an endearing concept in Christianity. I mean, it's like, do you really want to, you know, it's like, okay, do you really want to, if you live forever, well, even keeping life going for a long, long time in a purely physical sense, do you really want to work for 5,000 years? I mean, really, do you? Most people would say, no, I really don't want to work for 5,000 years. Anyway, that's just some of my random thoughts.
I want to do a coffee cup on that. The myth of the vampire is this being that lives forever. And if you read any of these good ones like Anne Rice, I love vampires, by the way. They're tortured souls. They just want to die. So I just very quick coffee cup on that topic of living forever.
And
Yeah,
Nick,
no, I like that thought. The vampires, they were, yeah, I guess that's their desire, Very fascinating. I kind of had a rough night, couldn't get to sleep for some reason, so I got up late. So I'm sorry I missed the opening, but fascinating conversation. My hit on it is a couple of things, and I'll be quick. I'll try to be quick. First, I first became very conscious of death at the age of 10 years old when I realized I'm gonna die. So I went to my mother's room and explained to her, I'm gonna die, so she comforted me and all of that. And so for a good amount of my life, I have been afraid of death. I'll just admit it. Okay. It's just only probably within the last 10, 15 years, even maybe, probably more like 10 years, that I have reconciled the notion that, yeah, I'm gonna die and it's okay. After having experienced the death of a couple of brothers and my best friend last year, it has a new pronounced impact on me. But I'll tell you, in I, like many of you, my spiritual tradition I was brought up as a Christian, and many different flavors of it. I even had several Mormon friends who educated me in Mormonism, and so we became close. And so across the board. But when I began to meditate in a Hindu-based meditation practice, I would go for several years to these satsangs. I even visited India for a retreat and everything. And basically, no one in this tradition ever asked for a donation. Like, you go to a church in the United States, they may pass the plate one or two times. You go to a Baptist church where I was Baptist, they'll pass it 3 or 4 times. Okay, so nothing wrong with that. It's just a tradition. But I marveled, and so I asked one of the brothers. I said, well, how does the mission stay afloat if they don't collect and take in anything? Which, mind you, in the United States, in the age of purpose-driven lives and all of those things, they've never gone too far away from the prosperity gospel, they call it. It's a very orange experience for a whole lot of Americans. In fact, throughout Africa, it's pretty much the same thing. They're very orange experience in Christianity, the prosperity gospel. And so that was my upbringing there. So when I had the opportunity to practice Hejmar, which they call now heartfulness, it was an interesting experience. And so the guy explained to me, well, you give when you want to, when you're moved to. So, okay, all right. So then, but a book came out, and the book was from the previous master who had just passed before I had gotten there. And he was speaking to the current master of the system, but from the dark, or not the dark, I can't remember what they called it, but basically not of this world. And he was having a conversation with the existing master who was on planet Earth today. And he would teach from this for several weeks or months. And so it blew my mind that it just was a whole nother way of looking at life. And when I asked him, and we talked about it, my friend who introduced me to this meditation practice, he basically said, and he was very aware and knowledgeable about spiral dynamics as well. And he said, Daryl, I would contend that heartfulness is beyond green, yellow, even turquoise. I would say it's approaching coral and teal. And so he was so involved with the meditation and how it benefited his life and everything else. He saw it as beyond the spiral. And I just thought that was fascinating because he's a very spirally informed man. And so I had never even considered having something beyond coral like teal. But anyway, I just thought that was an interesting contrast of how I was raised and how I got introduced to this Hindu-based meditation, which in many ways freed me up, to be honest with you. So this is my take on it.
Nice. Thanks, Daryl.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're getting almost to the end of the 2-hour session. Oh, Nicholas has had the coffee cup up. So I think Nicholas has something to say.
Oh yeah, I think it was mentioned about what Paul was saying about like learning the reincarnation. It reminded me how I talked to so many young people who are in green and who are like, I'm not going to have kids because one of my relatives had this and such genetic thing wrong with them. So I'm going to choose to never bring life into the world because I know all of this genetic stuff about me, and that's almost like the physical idea of past lives is like our past genetic coding that makes us who we are. And I just think it's very interesting now how green is very willing to not be okay with not bringing life in the world, as opposed to not wanting to die. You know, I feel like those two are connected things when it comes to death.
I think but don't you think it's because green is concerned for the overall system, the plant, like it's concerned about population and things like that, or it's something else?
It's partially that. Well, I mean, most of the people I talk to, it's just like, I can never bring kids into this planet. I mean, there's a lot of it.
Yep.
And but you see the blues reaction to them is saying they're doing abortions, they're killing, they're murdering, you know, from that perspective, it is like they're bringing death in from the blue to the green. But it is that same idea of to not bring life in if it's going to make them a more miserable life.
They're very pessimistic. It's very strange. I see that with green also.
Yeah, very nihilist. Green is very nihilistic.
Mm-hmm.
It's only after you get to like yellow where you're like, well, you know, there's a right place for a right time for everything, and we don't know what that time is, but I'm not going to judge anyone's actions for what they do because I don't know. I don't have enough data to know if what you're doing is right or wrong or not. But yeah, thanks for letting me share.
I have just a quick thing, and that you guys may have already covered it. I called in late, so I apologize if you already did. But I thought it was unique and something I came across where you was reading where we are and how we exist. You think about it, the particles, the atoms and cells that created us have been in the universe forever. And what is it about each of us individually that the universe decided allow these atoms to assemble and to be Daryl? And then after 100 years, if I should be so lucky, or 85, whatever it is, they'll go back into the universe. And so I just thought, I can't even remember where I read that, but I thought how powerful that each of us are made up of stardust that has been here from the get-go. And I just thought that was a fascinating thought.
It is. It's absolutely incredible. I think that's what, launches us into these existential questions.
For me, for many years, death is one of the most valuable tools to separate from tier 1 to tier 2 in the spiral dynamic. I feel that Don Beck is speaking a lot about tier 1 as a survival. It's not only the base, the whole tier 1 is about survival. So in one way, in order to achieve a second tier set of mind, you have to look at life beyond the fear of death. So I think this is why it's so crucial for second tier to achieve this level. Only then, when you are stopped fearing of death, you are stop thinking about your ego and about your own survival or your group survival, and start to look in real system thinking. Thank you.
Well, if that's the last comment about death, we can put this session to rest. Anyway, thanks everyone for joining us on this session about death, and we will see you next time. Bye.